Hey friends, welcome to another episode of the JOANNA WHALEY podcast. We have got an awesome episode in front of you, but before we get started today, a few ways you can watch this show live, recorded each and every week, and go to TikTok and find me at JOANNA WHALEY Music. You can also watch on Facebook. We also just started that live. You can also tune in and you can ask questions live on the show if you are part of those conversations. Other ways to get connected with some of the work that I'm doing, you can go to patreon.com/JOANNA WHALEY. That's patreon.com/JOANNA WHALEY. And we have a whole network of LGBTQ people who are also growing spiritually together there. I've kind of become their online pastor. So go to patreon.com/JOANNA WHALEY. And today on the podcast, right after this music, we're going to get started with our interview. Here we go. Can't get it out of my head. Can't get it out of my head. I will never be straight, but you say I'll be great if it's out of my head. All right, everyone, welcome to the show. If you watch this podcast recorded live on TikTok at JOANNA WHALEY Music, welcome, friends. If you're watching on Facebook, welcome. We already see some great friends on Facebook right now. We see some friends and we see some enemies on TikTok at the moment. But we have an awesome episode in front of you today. I want to bring you back to 2.5 years ago, maybe 3 years ago. I was working at this big mega church. That's no secret. If you've listened to this podcast, watched this live in the past, I was a mega church pastor, but I had this little problem. I suffered with gender dysphoria and I was a trans woman in the closet. And I started trying to figure out, like, how am I going to reconcile my faith with my gender? And I found a podcast that I listened to that all of my evangelical friends were obsessed with called this guy named Preston Sprinkle. And Preston has this big podcast, and I heard an episode, and one of the guests was a trans woman, and her name was Addie.
Hello.
Adelynn. And Adelynn was a voice that I heard, this presence and the Spirit of God speaking through a trans woman for the first time, I think, in my life. And it really resonated with me. I reached out to the show. Long story short, Addie has become my best friend in the world, and she's here in studio with us today. Hey, Addie, how are you?
It's good to be here all the way from California.
From San Diego, California. Oh, I'm so happy that you're here. And this is the first in-studio guest I've had on the show. And I told her, I said, hey, anything that you say is going to go live on the podcast. So, you know, we got to keep some of our inside jokes a little bit tame here today. But you know, Addie, for all of those who are listening on the podcast, who are listening live, tell us a little bit of your story, where you came from, and yeah, just kind of take us back to the beginning.
Yeah, so there's a lot of my story that I think a number of your listeners are going to definitely recognize. I was a trans kid, unidentified. I was not out of the closet as a child. But I was essentially a trans kid that grew up in a conservative evangelical context, went to church every Sunday, and I didn't really come out until I was at a Christian college in New York City.
Oh, wow. Wow.
That experience was something that kicked off a kind of a lifelong interest for me, but also just a personal quest to really understand what gender dysphoria is, what it isn't, and kind of dig more into the research that was being done, the clinical approaches that were being done, and kind of understand myself more. There was a lot that we're often told as trans people that is true about us, and a lot of it is based in misinformation.
Yeah, you could say that again.
Yeah, and just people that are not trained to really take care of you in a healthy way. So I started that journey, it's about 8 years now.
Wow.
Transitioned 8 years ago, so it feels like forever.
And you began your transition in it was a very conservative college in New York. if you want to share the name of the school, fine. If not, you don't have to. But, I think it's interesting to hear how you went through that process and what that was like for you, coming out in a really conservative school. Yeah, she's got a cough, so sometimes we have to. She's giving me the sign, and sometimes I might miss it.
That's during 2016 for me. I got my diagnosis with gender dysphoria, and I really had a few options at that point. My clinician told me I could find ways to manage it without transitioning. I could decide to maybe start presenting in different ways and seeing how that made me feel, or I could take arguably what was the harder but better situation for me, which was to come out and medically transition.
Right.
I did that, and it was not common sense for me to stay at this evangelical Christian college. However, I felt in my time in my faith journey there that just because I was a trans person, I still deserved access to faith spaces. Right. And I also, I didn't need to leave my community that I had built for the last 3 years just because I was making this change in my life. I remember telling God back then when I was, praying, being like, I'm going to go out on the limb and I'm going to take this step, because after a lot of prayer and discussing with my clinicians and others, it was the best choice for me. Yeah. But I didn't want to leave the church, and I didn't know how that was going to go down over the next 8 years, but I was committed to bringing those two things together.
And that, I think, your story, so many people say, hey, like, even though I'm trans, even though I'm queer, I don't feel that I want to let go of my faith. But the problem comes is that so many who hold faith don't think we can actually continue in that very faith because of who we are. And so I'm curious, kind of like what were kind of your experiences from the religious community? Share as much as you want about how you were treated in that process, and what that meant for you. Yeah,
it was an eventful and dynamic process, for sure, which is the polite way of saying.
That is the understatement of the century, I think.
The polite way of saying it was a shit show.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah.
However, I found in my journey, and maybe this is true for some of you guys, there are people that will surprise you. There are those people that you thought would never accept you in a million years, and they're just going to surprise you right off the bat. Right. And there's also people that you thought were going to be in your corner until you die, and they immediately run for the hills. Right. And then everything in between. But it was, it was something that I was met with some skepticism. And it was a time of my life where I was very trying to be managed by my people that were providing spiritual care. A lot of people who didn't understand the difference between being having gender dysphoria and being gay.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I remember sitting with a couple ex-gay in quotations,
big quotes there.
Ex-gay people who talked to me about how they developed their homosexuality and how developed their homosexuality, like it's some type of chronic illness.
Well, the reality is that a lot of the religious community has that kind of framework, that kind of idea that, like, being gay, let's even just talk about being gay in the first place. Being gay is somehow developed through bad decisions or bad upbringing. And it really is a false narrative that we deal with all the time. But then you add in the trans part of things. You add, hey, I'm trans. And then you get this whole new element of like, oh, well, you just don't like God's design for you. And that's just not the reality that we've experienced. And so, like, to try and the whole ex-gay, I think the Christian community is really good at using the wrong ways of treating things. They use the wrong, they have the wrong diagnosis, therefore they offer the wrong treatments. And so you have another part of your story that's really interesting, and I think people need to hear it. Because if you follow on TikTok at Joanna Whaley Music or on Facebook, I have a lot of conservative Republican friends because I was an evangelical pastor for 20 years of my life. And I think it's important to note that at one time you were an out trans woman and a part of the Republican Party. And I'm curious, and you were kind of an influencer for a minute in the Republican Party. So I'm curious, like, because you've gone through some major life changes in that area. Talk us through some of that and like how your world has changed and what somebody who may be in some really conservative ideas or families and how to kind of navigate that, being somebody who's experienced life on both sides of the ideological spectrum.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up because I do think that there's this misconception, this archetype of who the LGBT Christian is and how they act. People assume that they're going to be progressive in politics. People assume that they are not going to be good students of the Bible, that they don't understand how biblical interpretation works. There's all of these kind of things that, like, if you come out and you're a Christian, obviously you don't know what you're doing and you just threw God behind you and left.
Yeah, which is so unfair because the reality, there's so many, if we just look at Christianity, there's so many, and I've talked about this many times on the show, there's so many different sects of Christianity. And within Christianity, there are so many queer people who are Christian. And just to say that you can't is just ignoring the reality of who's right in front of you, you know? And so I'm curious, kind of like, you know, if somebody's listening right now and even maybe they're skeptical of more progressive theology, what would your thoughts and input be for somebody who's like, okay, you're not sure what you believe about, you know, more progressive ideas of God, but you're still trying to find your way as maybe a closeted person or an out queer person. How can you like navigate those tensions?
Well, I think the first thing is get a group of people or close friends around you that are going to affirm and speak positive things to you. I don't think anyone can really survive without someone to lean on, without some encouragement. And so if you are making that decision like I did for many, many years to stay in an environment that is hostile or non-affirming, you definitely need some close friends that are going to kind of support you through the tough times, because your community, and it saddens me to say this, but your community is probably not going to be in that institution or church.
Right. Yeah. And I've always said that if you're someone who is, if you're LGBTQ and you're trying to figure out, is my church safe? Is my church a place where I can be included and part of worship? Like, it's really obvious. Like, it's very, very obvious of who you like, of if your church is that safe place for you.
If they don't say gay, don't stay.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So for those of you who have been a part of, for those of you who have been a part of the whole, you know, the queer community, and you're also part of someone who's trying to understand your spirituality, like, I think what I've learned, and I've learned through our friendship, is the word yes. And I think that, and you have fought through a lot in your world, and I'm honored to know you, and I'm honored to even just be like a fly on the wall of like the process of spirituality as a trans person. And for that, I just want to say thank you. And And if you want to answer some questions from people on the other side, as we were in the middle of this recording, somebody reported us for hate speech on TikTok. This is one of the unfair things of TikTok. I think at times people like to go against us as queer people because we talk about something that's needed. So on the other side of the music, friends, we're going to open up. We have lots of text questions and people that may want to chat with us. We'll be right back after this short message. Hey friends, it seems like everyone and their mom has a podcast these days, and everyone and their mom wants you to join their Patreon. So why on earth would you join my Patreon? Here's why. Our Patreon community is a little bit different because we are building a community of LGBTQ people and allies who need spiritual support. Let's be honest, many of my listeners may have a lot of distrust with clergy, and you need a place to talk safely with someone like me, a former pastor who is a trans woman. And we can really dive into some of the nitty-gritty of your experience. Go to patreon.com/Joanna Whaley and join a whole community of people right now. That's patreon.com/Joanna Whaley. We would love to see you there. All right, friends, welcome back. I think we figured out our live business. If you're somebody who watches our show live, we do apologize for the interruption. But we're going to actually take some questions here on the show. And we have so many text messages that came in this week. And some of them are really difficult. Like just reading through some of these questions this week, I mean, honestly, started to break my heart a little bit. Carrie from Chino, California said this. She asked, 10 years ago, I came out to my parents as trans, and they have not talked to me since. I've been typing this on Father's Day and trying to find myself. I'm finding myself in a really low place this time of year. What would you suggest as a healthy way of coping with pain? I love Pride Month, but I hate Father's Day being in the middle of it. Ooh, yeah, this is tough. I feel like so many times it can be so hard. Like a lot of holidays fall in the middle of sometimes really joyous things, like even Christmas. Christmas can be hard for people. And if you're disconnected from your family, I actually would really encourage you, Carrie, to listen to tomorrow's episode, as we're going to be talking pretty in depth about family systems and family rejection, as it is a really common thing that we deal with in the queer community. What are your thoughts on this, Addie? This is really hard.
Just some resources that I'm thinking of on the top of my head. I'm not quite sure the name of it. This might nudge your memory a little bit, but there's like a moms group that support LGBT people that don't have families.
Oh, that's beautiful.
It's like, I want to say it's like Mama Bears, or if you just
I've heard of that.
Yeah, so maybe we can get that in the show notes or descriptions, but it's basically a place where you get paired with a mom that is affirming. And they'll write you letters on holidays, and they'll kind of keep you in, like you're part of their virtual family.
Right. That makes sense now, because I've seen that on Facebook. I've seen like Mama Bears. I'm like, what is that? I didn't know what it was, but now it makes sense to me because it's always allies and people I know. We are back on TikTok Live. If you want to have a discussion about this, you want to join us, request to join the conversation. We'd love to have you here on the podcast and have a conversation about this. Let's talk pride and religion. And we have a lot of text message questions that we can touch on here too. We have another one from Sarah in Raleigh, North Carolina. You know what? We're going to talk about that one tomorrow. Let's see. I've got so many texts here. Michael in Houston, Texas says, says, why do people have to be so mean to the LGBTQ community in Christianity? I do not understand why they treat people like this. Great question. I mean, just today, if you're listening to this podcast, I mean, when you watch, even if you watch this podcast live, we get an amazingly ridiculous amount of people in our live comment sections who just say some of the most awful things to me for being a queer Christian. And I don't get it. Like, to me, there's this massive disconnect between what is, between the loving Christian faith and what we see coming out of the mouths of people sometimes. But I'm sure my friend Addie here is a history nerd, can probably tell you a lot about the history. Like, there's been a lot of history, unfortunately, of faith systems oppressing our community, So these are some thoughts we have there. And Michael, I think the answer to that is, I don't freaking know.
And I would also say, Michael, I've been on a long journey for self-healing and working on my mental health. And what I have learned primarily is that someone's anger response says way more about them than it does you. So a strategy that I have learned in dealing with hate or dealing and building up your resilience as a LGBT person is pause and take a breath and acknowledge that whatever someone is doing or is saying to you in the moment, acknowledge to yourself that that is wrong and you don't deserve it.
Yeah.
It's called, when we have a fire, we have stop, drop, and roll.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
This is stop, it's stop and then say why it's wrong and then affirm yourself.
Yeah.
And if you do that in the moment over and over, it's going to be a little bit easier to turn down the volume of all these people.
Exactly. We have it looks like Gracie joining in from TikTok. How are you, friend?
I'm good.
Hey, how old are you, Gracie?
I'm 15.
Okay, unfortunately, we can only talk to 18-year-olds here on the show. It is in the literal background of our lives. So if you want to talk and you're over 18, we want to have a conversation about this. We want to have a conversation about being LGBTQ and being queer. If you have questions, you want to add a loving, constructive comment. You can disagree, but you need to be loving. And you need to be kind. And it's really freaking crazy that I have to say that, right? Like, it's crazy that I have to say, like, and sometimes it's entertaining. If you've listened to this show recently, there's been a lot of entertainment.
It's kind of funny because, what the LGBT community is often accused of is coming after our children.
Yeah.
And this time they're coming into our space.
Exactly. And so we want to, and that's the thing, like, a lot of times people will ask me, how do you keep a calm face with all of the hatred and all of the things that we hear? But it sometimes it's really hard. And I think it's important to understand, like, and I'm speaking specifically to those that want to belittle the queer community. Like, you're talking to a human being. You know what I'm saying? Like, you are talking to human beings. Now, like, we put on good faces live, and this is, if you watch this is like radio, right? So, like, I'm going to remain professional, but you better believe that when I get off of the air, I'm definitely talking to people like, you won't believe what this person said to me today. You know, like, it's ridiculous. But anyways, so I'm going to hit another text message question here. We had a great question about being polyamorous last week. So good. It was such a cool question. But this one is from Rain in Raleigh, North Carolina, asks this question. Says, I have been experimenting with girls' clothes when I am alone, but I attend a big church here in Oklahoma City. I have feelings that I am sinning when I do this because I get urges when I go out in public, dressed as a girl. Am I doing something wrong, or am I just experiencing something that is normal? Great question. And I don't know if you have thoughts on this. You kind of perked up because this is something we've talked about quite a bit, is that, like, I experienced this, and then post-transition, I had a very different relationship with clothing. And so what are your thoughts on this?
I just think like before you come out, it feels something that's very secretive. It's very intense. It's usually, for me, it was an experience that gave trauma. And so your heart's beating and you might feel scared, anxious, your stomach is kind of turning. All of these things can make you feel like you're doing something wrong, because they're the same feelings we get when we do something wrong.
Sure.
So the idea is that after your transition and you're out and you're your authentic self, like a lot of those feelings that you're wrestling with are going to go away. But also in the meantime, you're not doing anything wrong. You are exploring who you are. You are expressing your style the way you want. And there is nothing sinful about that.
So true. Somebody said in a chat here, says, I struggle as a spiritual gal. I read the Bible and interpretation matters. I think that's not quite related to what you were saying. But this person also says, people who make us feel bad have no business in our feelings in the first place. And it's hard to like work through those things, because we get to, like this person was saying who texted in, we're told what is right and wrong, but we're never allowed the experience to like understand the feelings that we're feeling. And there's a lot of parts of me that I wasn't allowed to understand until post-transition. And then once I measured them up to my faith, I'm like, oh, this is not as big of a deal as everyone interpreted it to be. I have learned that most of our experience, again, is based off of trauma.
Yeah. And so I had something I struggled with and still do to this day, but it's cognitive distortions. There's many of them when you do DBT therapy. It's a popular therapy for individuals that have experienced trauma. But in DBT, we have black and white thinking. And honestly, a lot of us are in that headspace all the time. And so you're thinking in your head that you're wrong or this is bad or something. And oftentimes it takes recorrecting the brain, because you've said that to yourself millions of times.
Exactly. If you're someone who's watching this show live on TikTok at Joanna Whaley Music, if you want to have a respectful conversation and you want to be kind and you're over 18, hit the guest button. We'd love to have you here. We're doing a live recording of the podcast. If you're on Facebook, you can send in a message there as well. We would love to chat with you. And somebody here just said, it's gross how much hate is in the world. People deserve to enjoy their life. And that's the reality. One time I remember I did a TikTok video on this a few months ago. I was at Kroger. I was just at the store buying nacho supplies, and you'll see it. It's pinned on because I'm obsessed with nachos and I'm addicted to them. Whatever. Sue me is what I said.
She doesn't let me eat them because it's nacho cheese.
That's right. They're mine. But I was in the aisle and I saw somebody in the aisle that I was like, this person is not going to be okay with me because of articles of clothing that were being worn. But the reality is that this person, they were kind of blocking the whole aisle. And I was kind of sitting there, and the guy moved his car and said, I'm so sorry, ma'am. And in that moment, it struck me. I'm like, listen, if people could just let others live their life, me being a woman does not affect your life in any way, shape, or form. And me worshiping in a church as a trans woman does not affect your life or your Christianity in any way, shape, or form. And it doesn't need to. We're running up to the end of this episode. If you're listening to this, sometimes when we record live, go to TikTok and find me at Joanna Whaley Music. We record multiple episodes at once. My friend Addie here is going to be a regular guest on the show over the next years. You're going to see her and you're going to hear her a lot over the next few years because we've kind of finally reconnected. But we'll be taking questions on our next episode as well, hoping to have some respectful conversation about queerness and religion. Thank you so much, friends, for listening to us today. We hope you have an awesome day. And this has been a production of Whaley Media. Go join us at patreon.com/Joanna Whaley. We would love, love, love to have you as part of that community. Once again, go know that you can have spirituality and be you and love who you love. We'll see you tomorrow. I hate it all that I can see. Can't get it out of my